The soft hum of the aircraft engines filled the luxurious first-class cabin. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee, a hint of expensive cologne, and the subtle leather aroma of the oversized reclining seats. The flight attendants moved with quiet precision, attending to passengers who had paid thousands for the privilege of comfort. A man in his late 40s, Richard Carter, adjusted the cuffs of his designer suit, his platinum watch catching the light. He was the type who measured his worth by the price tags on his clothes and the balance in his bank account. Today, he was flying from Los Angeles to London for a high-stakes business meeting, and nothing irritated him more than being surrounded by people he deemed unworthy of first-class treatment. As Richard took his seat, he glanced at the man next to him, a plain-looking guy in a simple hoodie, baseball cap pulled low over his face. His sneakers looked worn, and his duffel bag wasn't a luxury brand, just something an average traveler would carry. Richard scoffed internally, probably some lottery winner or influencer, who barely scraped together enough to afford this ticket. As the flight attendants continued their pre-flight checks, Richard noticed the man beside him was unusually quiet, seemingly uninterested in the lavish surroundings. He simply adjusted his cap and leaned back in his seat, avoiding eye contact. Richard couldn't hold back his irritation. He signaled for a flight attendant. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice carrying an edge of entitlement. "Are you sure the seat assignment is correct? I was expecting a certain standard in first class." The flight attendant, a young woman with a patient smile, nodded. "Yes, sir. All seating arrangements are correct." Richard sighed dramatically, shaking his head. "No offense, but first class isn't what it used to be. Back in the day, you'd only see high-net-worth individuals here, not well." He waved his hand dismissively toward the man beside him. "People dressed like that." The man in the hoodie didn't react. He simply exhaled slowly, tilting his head slightly, as if he had heard this kind of judgment before. A few passengers glanced over, sensing the tension, but no one intervened. Richard, emboldened by the lack of response, leaned back in his seat with a smirk. "Listen, buddy," Richard said, his voice just loud enough to be condescending. "No offense, but I bet you used some credit card points or a lucky break to get here. First class is for real businessmen, you know? People who actually work for their success." Still, the man in the hoodie said nothing. He just adjusted his cap and turned his gaze toward the flight attendants prepping for takeoff. Richard let out a small chuckle. "Yeah, that's what I thought. Some people just don't belong here." What Richard didn't realize, what would shock him beyond words, was that the man sitting next to him wasn't just anyone. He was Tom Cruise. And soon, Richard was going to regret every word he had just said. Richard settled deeper into his plush first-class seat, satisfied with himself. He had made his point. This was an elite space, and people like his seatmate didn't belong in it. He glanced at the man in the hoodie again, expecting a reaction, maybe a flustered excuse or an awkward attempt to justify his presence. Instead, the guy remained still, seemingly unaffected, staring out the window as if the words hadn't even reached him. That irritated Richard even more. Who did this guy think he was, ignoring him like that? A flight attendant arrived with champagne. "Would you like a glass, sir?" she asked, offering a chilled flute. Richard took it with a smirk. "Ah, now this is what first class is about," he said, swirling the glass. "Luxury, not hoodies." He shot another glance at his silent neighbor. The flight attendant hesitated, her eyes darting toward the man in the hoodie for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Richard to notice. Wait, was that recognition? He frowned slightly. Maybe he had misread it. But why did she seem so careful? The man beside him still hadn't spoken, hadn't reacted. It was as if he was used to people like Richard making assumptions. That calmness, it was unsettling. Richard exhaled sharply, then turned to introduce himself the way he did at high-class networking events. Maybe he could make this guy uncomfortable enough to move seats. "I'm Richard Carter," he said, his voice exuding self-importance. "I own a multi-million-dollar real estate company. I deal with elite clients, celebrities, and the kind of people who truly belong in first class." He extended a hand, expecting the man to be impressed, or at the very least intimidated. Finally, the man in the hoodie turned his head slightly, his face still shadowed under the cap. He glanced at Richard's outstretched hand, but didn't take it. Instead, he gave a slight nod and said in a calm, unbothered tone, "Nice." That was it. One word. No follow-up. No interest. Nothing. Richard's brow furrowed. Who acts like that? Most people would have at least pretended to be impressed. "Yeah," Richard continued, forcing a chuckle. "So what do you do? You an Instagram influencer or something?" The man barely reacted. "Something like that," he replied nonchalantly. Richard scoffed. "Let me guess. TikTok? Crypto? One of those new money things." He leaned in, smirking. "Come on, don't be shy. What's your claim to fame?" The man finally turned to face him, and for the first time, Richard caught a glimpse beneath the cap. There was something familiar about him. His jawline, his nose, something in his expression. Richard narrowed his eyes. Where have I seen him before? The man just gave a knowing smile and turned back to the window. And in that moment, a small, uneasy feeling settled in Richard's stomach. Something about this guy wasn't right. Something about this guy felt bigger than he was letting on. The plane began taxiing toward the runway, and Richard exhaled, forcing himself to relax. Who cares who this guy is? He told himself. Probably some nobody who got lucky. Still, something about him gnawed at Richard's thoughts. The flight attendant's hesitation, the way the man carried himself. Not nervous, not out of place. Just comfortable. Richard wasn't used to seeing someone in casual clothes act like they belonged in first class. Usually people like that were either overly excited or intimidated, grateful for the experience. But this guy, he didn't even blink. As the plane lifted off the ground, Richard tried to push it from his mind. Instead, he pulled out his laptop, determined to finalize his presentation for the meeting in London. But just as he started typing, the flight attendant from earlier returned. "Mr. Cruz," she said softly, leaning toward Richard's seatmate with a smile. "Can I get you anything?" Richard froze. "Mr. Cruz?" The man in the hoodie glanced up. His eyes flickered toward Richard for the briefest second before he nodded at the flight attendant. "Just some water, please." "Right away, sir," she said warmly. Richard's heart skipped a beat. He turned sharply, staring at the man beside him. No, it couldn't be. Tom Cruise? For the first time, Richard really looked at him. The strong jawline, the distinctive nose, the confident but relaxed posture. It was all there. He had been sitting next to one of the most famous actors in the world, and hadn't even realized it. Blood drained from Richard's face. He had mocked, dismissed, and insulted Tom freaking Cruise. Suddenly, all his words came rushing back. "People like you don't belong here. You probably use credit card points. First class is for real businessmen." Richard swallowed hard. For the first time in years, he felt small. He scrambled for damage control, his mind racing for a way to fix his mistake before it became public. What if someone recorded that exchange? What if people found out that he, Richard Carter, a high-profile businessman, had humiliated himself in front of an A-list celebrity? He forced a chuckle, desperately trying to shift the mood. "Oh man," he said, his voice suddenly overly friendly. "You really had me there. I had no idea it was you, Mr. Cruz." Tom Cruise smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile Richard wanted. It was amused, patient, knowing. "No worries," Tom said calmly, taking his glass of water from the flight attendant. Richard laughed again, louder than necessary. "Wow, I mean, what are the odds, right?" He extended his hand again, suddenly eager for a handshake. "Richard Carter. Big fan, by the way. Love your movies." Tom glanced at the hand but didn't take it. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, eyes glinting with something Richard couldn't quite place. "It's interesting," Tom said after a moment. "You had a lot to say before. Seemed like you had me all figured out." Richard's forced smile wavered. The words were casual, but the weight behind them felt heavy. Richard stammered. He wasn't used to this. He was the one who usually had the upper hand. Tom didn't raise his voice. He didn't sound angry. If anything, he looked amused, curious, like a man watching someone talk themselves into a corner. Richard could feel the eyes of other first-class passengers on him now. A few had already taken out their phones, recording. His stomach twisted. This wasn't just some minor embarrassment. This was turning into a full-blown disaster. And it was only going to get worse. Richard's pulse quickened as his mind scrambled for a way out of this nightmare. Passengers in first class were murmuring now, some sneaking glances, others openly staring. A few had even pulled out their phones, no doubt recording what they sensed was unfolding. A moment of poetic justice. Tom Cruise, one of the biggest stars in the world, sat there calmly, effortlessly composed. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't retaliating. He didn't need to. Richard was destroying himself. His forced grin stretched wider. "Hey, you know how it is," he said, waving a hand as if nothing had happened. "Sometimes you just don't recognize someone out of context, right? I mean, you're always in a suit, jumping off buildings in movies. I wasn't expecting you to be so, casual." Tom raised an eyebrow. "So if I wore a suit, you'd think I belonged here?" Richard swallowed. He had walked into another trap. No, that's not what I meant," he stammered. "I was just saying." Tom gave a slow nod, as if he already knew exactly what Richard meant. Richard's palms were sweating now. He reached for his champagne flute, trying to steady himself. But just as he lifted it, the plane hit turbulence. His hand jerked. The glass tipped. Cold champagne spilled all over his expensive designer suit. A gasp rippled through first class. Someone snickered. A flight attendant rushed forward with napkins, but Richard could already feel the warmth in his cheeks. His perfectly curated image was unraveling by the second. "Let me help," Tom said, handing Richard a napkin. Richard hesitated before snatching it. Great. Now even Tom Cruise was pitying him. Trying to salvage what little dignity he had left, Richard forced out a laugh. "Guess I deserved that, huh?" Tom shrugged, still composed. "I wasn't going to say it." More chuckles from the passengers. Richard clenched his jaw. This flight couldn't end soon enough. Subplot. The business disaster. Desperate to distract himself, Richard pulled out his laptop to focus on work. He needed to prepare for his meeting in London. If he could close this deal, he'd land a multi-million-dollar contract. But as he opened his email, his stomach dropped. A new message. Subject: urgent contract at risk. His boss, Stephen Adler, had written, "Richard, I just received word that the London investors are having second thoughts. They've been reviewing your recent interviews and find your elitist attitude concerning. If we don't salvage this, we may lose the deal. Call me ASAP." Stephen Richards' hands went cold. No, this couldn't be happening. He was supposed to be untouchable. His reputation was his greatest asset, his confidence, his ability to command respect in a room. But if people were starting to see him as an arrogant, out-of-touch snob, his career was in danger. And he knew exactly how he had earned that reputation. His heart pounded. He could already see it. The headlines, the viral clips of this very interaction with Tom Cruise. If this got out, God, I need damage control. Fast. The redemption attempt. Richard turned to Tom, his expression suddenly sincere. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice. "I think we got off on the wrong foot. Can I buy you a drink? Maybe talk?" Tom studied him for a moment, then smirked slightly. "You mean, now that you know who I am?" Richard's face burned. No, it's not like that," he lied. Look, I shouldn't have said what I said earlier. It was out of line." Tom tilted his head. "Which part? The part where you said I didn't belong? Or the part where you assumed I was broke?" Richard winced. There was no easy way out of this. "I was wrong," he admitted, for the first time in years. Tom sipped his water, then set it down. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I don't actually care what you said about me. But I do wonder, if I were just some regular guy, would you still apologize?" Richard hesitated. And in that moment he realized something. Tom Cruise wasn't just teaching him a lesson. He was giving him a choice. Richard felt exposed, like a man standing in front of a crowd with no place to hide. Tom's question hung in the air. "If I were just some regular guy, would you still apologize?" It was a direct hit. A question so simple, yet so damning. And Richard didn't have an answer. His entire life, he had prided himself on his ability to control the narrative, to shape how people saw him. But now, sitting next to one of the most powerful men in Hollywood, with the eyes of other passengers watching, he realized something terrifying. For the first time, his usual tactics weren't working. No amount of charm, networking, or arrogance could get him out of this. Richard swallowed hard. I don't know. Tom nodded, as if he expected that response. He didn't say anything for a moment, letting Richard sit with the weight of his own admission. That silence was worse than any lecture, any retaliation, any public humiliation. The tension was thick. A few first-class passengers pretended not to listen, but their stolen glances, the way their ears perked up, Richard knew they were hanging on every word. This wasn't just about one mistake. This was about who Richard Carter really was. And for the first time, he didn't like the answer. The unexpected twist just when Richard thought things couldn't get worse. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have some unexpected turbulence ahead. Please remain in your seats and fasten your seatbelts." A sharp jolt rocked the plane. The overhead lights flickered. Richard's breath caught. He wasn't a fan of turbulence. His mind started racing, his chest tightening. Not now. Not on this flight. Another jolt. A drop. The cabin shuddered. Some passengers gasped. A flight attendant quickly reassured them. But Richard's knuckles turned white as he gripped the armrest. His heart pounded. His mind flashed back to something buried deep inside. A memory he tried to ignore. It was years ago. His father's plane crash. Richard had been just a kid when it happened. But the fear, the helplessness, it never truly left him. He clenched his jaw, trying to push it down. But his body betrayed him. His breathing turned shallow. His hands trembled. Tom noticed. The superstar glanced at Richard, then at his hands. For the first time in the entire flight, the power dynamic shifted. Richard wasn't the arrogant businessman anymore. He was just a scared man on a plane, fighting old demons. And Tom was the one in control. The moment of truth, another drop. Richard sucked in a sharp breath. Tom leaned in, speaking calmly, evenly. "Breathe," he said. "In through your nose, out through your mouth." Richard hesitated but followed his lead. "In and out," Tom repeated. "You're fine. You're in control." Richard's hands were still shaking, but slowly his breathing steadied. The plane hit another jolt. But this time, he didn't flinch as hard. Tom sat back, watching him, waiting. Richard wiped his palms on his pants, feeling humiliated but grateful. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Tom didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He just nodded. "No problem." And in that moment, Richard realized something staggering. Tom Cruise had every reason to humiliate him, to call him out in front of everyone, to make him suffer. But he didn't. Instead, he did the exact opposite. He helped. He showed Richard the kind of character, grace, and patience that Richard himself had failed to show. And that realization, it hit harder than anything else. Richard sat in stunned silence, his breathing finally steadying after the turbulence. He had spent the entire flight judging, mocking, and dismissing Tom Cruise, convinced that the man next to him didn't belong in first class. And yet, when he needed help the most, Tom was the one who had saved him from his own fear. Not with power, not with wealth, not with status, with patience, with understanding, with kindness. Richard let out a slow breath, staring at the seat in front of him. For the first time in his life, he didn't just see someone more powerful than him. He saw someone better than him. And it made him sick to his stomach, because he had spent so much of his life looking down on others, measuring worth in material things, never realizing how empty that truly was. A flight attendant passed by, placing dessert on their trays. A slice of cheesecake for Richard, a fruit platter for Tom. As the flight attendant turned to leave, Richard hesitated. Then, before he could stop himself, he spoke. "Excuse me." The flight attendant paused, surprised. "Yes, sir?" Richard's throat felt tight. The words were hard to say, but for the first time, he knew they needed to be said. "I owe him an apology," he said, nodding toward Tom. "And I'd like to cover anything he wants on this flight." The flight attendant blinked. Other passengers, still eavesdropping, looked on with curiosity. Tom, however, just smiled. A knowing, patient smile. "That's a nice gesture," Tom said, picking up a piece of mango from his tray. "But you know something, Richard?" Richard tensed. "What?" Tom set down his fork, finally meeting Richard's eyes with full intensity. "The real apology," he said, "isn't for me. It's for the next person you judge before you know their story." Richard's chest tightened. Because Tom was right. This wasn't about just one moment on a plane. This was about who Richard was when no one was watching. A man who judged, dismissed, and assumed the worst. And for the first time, he hated that version of himself. The realization settled deep, painful, necessary, transformative. Richard didn't say anything. He just nodded, not out of defeat, but out of understanding. And for the first time in his life, Richard Carter, the arrogant businessman, felt something he had never truly felt before. Humbled. The rest of the flight passed in quiet contemplation. Richard barely touched his dessert. His laptop sat open, the glowing screen full of meaningless numbers and reports. But he wasn't thinking about business anymore. He was thinking about himself. For years, he had built his success on power, status, and control. He spoke in boardrooms with certainty, walked into luxury events expecting respect, and treated people as if they existed in tiers, worthy or unworthy. And in just a few hours, Tom Cruise had shattered all of that. Not with a lecture, not with anger, not even with revenge, just by showing grace where Richard had shown arrogance. A moment of reflection at some point, Richard glanced around the first-class cabin and saw the faces of the people he had ignored before. The older woman across the aisle who had been quietly knitting the whole flight. He had assumed she was just some wealthy retiree. But what if she was a former CEO, a brilliant scientist, a person with a lifetime of stories he had never bothered to consider? The young man in glasses a few rows ahead, typing furiously on his laptop. He had looked too casual to be important. But maybe he was an entrepreneur, building something world-changing. And then there was Tom, one of the most famous men in the world, a man who could have flown in a private jet, but chose to sit among ordinary people. No entourage, no attention-seeking, just living. And Richard had insulted him. The worst part, he knew this wasn't just about Tom Cruise. How many others had he dismissed, insulted, or belittled, without even knowing their stories? His chest felt tight. For the first time in years, Richard Carter felt something foreign to him. Regret. As the captain announced their descent into London, Richard turned to Tom one last time. "I meant what I said," he admitted. "I was wrong. About a lot of things." Tom leaned back, arms crossed, studying him. "What are you going to do about it?" Richard exhaled. "I don't know. But I think it's time I figure that out." Tom nodded approvingly. "Good answer." Silence stretched between them. But this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of understanding. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Richard grabbed his briefcase, feeling strangely lighter. He had come on this flight expecting to seal a multi-million-dollar deal. Instead, he had walked away with something far more valuable. A lesson. The cabin doors opened, and passengers began gathering their belongings. Richard remained seated for a moment, watching as Tom Cruise, the man he had judged so harshly, stood up, stretched, and grabbed his simple duffel bag. For a man who could have had an entire team waiting for him outside, he moved with an ease that struck Richard as almost unnatural for someone so famous. No security detail, no assistance, just a man. Before stepping into the aisle, Tom turned back, one last glance at Richard. "Good luck," he said. "It's never too late to be better." Then with a small nod he was gone. Richard sat there staring after him. His mind kept replaying those words. It's never too late to be better. For years, he had seen success as a competition. Who had the most money, the biggest deals, the best seat on the plane. And yet, here was Tom Cruise, a global superstar, proving that real power didn't come from arrogance. It came from character. Richard stood grabbing his briefcase. As he walked off the plane, something felt different. For the first time in his entire life, he wasn't thinking about status. He was thinking about the kind of man he wanted to be. A new beginning. A few weeks later, Richard sat at a small cafe in New York, waiting for someone. Across from him sat a young intern, nervous, wide-eyed, the type of kid Richard would have brushed off months ago. But not today. Today he listened. The kid was passionate about business, eager to prove himself, filled with ideas. And Richard, for the first time in his life, truly cared about what someone else had to say. He offered advice, encouragement. He even recommended the intern for a major project, something he never would have done before. And as the kid left, Grateful and excited, Richard smiled. Because for once his success wasn't about him. And that felt better than any first-class seat ever could. The end.